It started on a cold November evening. The wind howled outside, shaking the bare branches of the oak tree that towered over our old family home. I had just moved back in after my father passed away, leaving me the house and its contents. Among those, the most notable was the grandfather clock in the living room. The clock had been in our family for generations, standing tall with its dark, polished wood and brass pendulum. It had always been there, ticking away the seconds in the background. As a child, I used to be fascinated by it, often sitting in front of it and watching the pendulum swing back and forth. But since my return, something was different. The clock's chime, which used to sound melodious and comforting, now had an eerie, hollow resonance that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to my overactive imagination fueled by the grief of losing my father. One night, as I sat alone in the dimly lit living room, I heard a faint whisper. I froze, the hair on my neck standing on end. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the whisper was clear, distinct. It seemed to be coming from the grandfather clock. I approached the clock cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering grew louder, though I still couldn't make out the words. I pressed my ear against the wooden case, and that's when I heard it clearly. Tick, tock, time stops. I recoiled, stumbling backward, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was deep, gravelly, and it sounded impossibly ancient. I stared at the clock in horror, its pendulum now swinging faster than before, the ticking echoing loudly in the otherwise silent room. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, but the next day, it happened again. This time, the voice was clearer, more insistent. Time is running out. I could barely sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the clock's voice, whispering in my ear, the words growing more frantic, more urgent. I started avoiding the living room altogether, but the whispering seemed to follow me wherever I went. It was in the walls, in the floors, in the very air around me. The final straw came one night when I heard not just the clock, but the sound of footsteps echoing through the house. Heavy, deliberate footsteps like someone was pacing back and forth. But when I checked, no one was there. I became paranoid, convinced the clock was somehow alive, that it was trying to tell me something. But what? I started searching through old family records, desperate to find some clue, some explanation. That's when I found an old journal belonging to my great-grandfather. The entries were erratic, the handwriting frantic. He wrote about the clock, about how it had started speaking to him, too, just before his death. The last entry was barely legible, but the words curse and trapped stood out, sending chills down my spine. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. The clock wasn't just a family heirloom. It was a prison, holding something, or someone, within it. And now it was trying to break free. I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I packed a bag and left that night, the clock's whispers chasing me as I fled. I've been staying with a friend ever since, but I still hear it sometimes, in the quiet moments when I'm alone. The tick, tock, and that voice, cold and ancient, whispering in my ear, time is running out. I know I can't escape it forever. The clock is waiting, and one day it will come for me, just as it did for my father and his father before him. Because time, it seems, is a curse that cannot be broken. I thought leaving the house would grant me some peace, but the clock's whispers had wormed their way into my mind, haunting my every thought. The nights were the worst. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. But every night, without fail, I would hear that voice, distant at first, but growing closer and more insistent. Time is running out. It was as if the clock was tethered to me, no matter how far I ran. Days turned into weeks, and my life began to unravel. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything but the relentless ticking in my head. My friends grew concerned, urging me to see a doctor, but how could I explain that my torment wasn't born of madness, but of something far worse? Something ancient and malevolent. Desperation led me back to the house. I had to find a way to end this, to break whatever curse had latched onto my family. As soon as I stepped inside, the air felt thicker, heavier. The house was cold, unnaturally so, and the familiar smell of dust and old wood was tainted by a faint, metallic scent that I couldn't quite place. The clock stood in the living room, as imposing as ever. Its face seemed darker, the numbers barely visible in the dim light. The pendulum swung slowly, deliberately, as if mocking me. "Why won't you leave me alone?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The clock responded with a low, rumbling chuckle that vibrated through the floorboards. "Time waits for no one." I stared at it, anger and fear swirling within me. I couldn't live like this anymore. I had to destroy it, end this nightmare once and for all. Without thinking, I grabbed a nearby poker from the fireplace and swung it at the clock with all my strength. The wood splintered, the glass face shattered, but instead of silence, a deafening roar erupted from within the clock. The force of the sound knocked me back, and I watched in horror as the clock began to mend itself, the wood knitting back together, the glass reforming. It was as if the clock was alive, feeding off the very essence of the house. And then I saw it, the shadows. They began to leak out from the cracks in the clock, coalescing into a dark, swirling mess. The room grew colder, the air thick with the stench of decay. The shadows twisted and writhed, taking on vague, humanoid shapes. I could see faces in the darkness, twisted in agony, their eyes hollow and pleading. "Help us," they moaned, their voices like a chorus of the damned. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. These were the souls trapped within the clock, the victims of its curse. My great-grandfather's journal had mentioned something about a ritual, a way to bind a spirit to an object, but I hadn't understood the full implications until now. The clock wasn't just a prison, it was a doorway, a gateway to something far worse, and I had opened it. The shadows surged forward, With every ounce of strength I had left, I lunged at the clock, grabbing the pendulum. The moment my hand touched it, a surge of energy shot through me, burning hot and cold at the same time. I gritted my teeth, pulling with all my might. The shadows shrieked in fury, their forms dissolving into the air as I yanked the pendulum free from its hinges. The clock's chime rang out one final time, a deep, resonant toll that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The shadows dissipated, the cold lifted, and the air became still. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The clock was silent, its face cracked, the pendulum lying broken beside it. I had done it, I had broken the cycle. The whispers were gone, the voices silenced. But I knew the cost had been great. When I finally found the strength to leave the house, I could feel the weight of all those lost souls pressing down on me. The clock was no longer a threat, but the memory of what had happened would haunt me forever. My family had been cursed for generations, and I had been the one to end it, but the price was steep. As I walked away, I glanced back at the house one last time. The windows were dark, the door firmly shut. The house seemed to sag, as if relieved of a great burden. But I knew I could never return. The clock may have been silenced, but its legacy would remain, a dark stain on our family's history. And as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that, somewhere deep within that house, a faint ticking still echoed, waiting for the next soul to wander too close.